If you are listening to this, you likely understand the slow ache of being forgotten. This is exactly for you. There is something no one tells you about grief. It doesn't only come from loss. Sometimes it comes from betrayal. At my husband's funeral, no one came but me. The coffin was an island of polished mahogany, a fortress. Around it, the pews echoed with emptiness. The shock was not a sound, but a cold, deep silence. It arrived before the tears. I stood alone. For 50 years I had believed in a kind of permanence, in the unbreakable contract of blood and family. I had learned the secret language of motherhood, sacrifice without expectation. My children were not stuck in traffic. They were not sick. They simply chose parties over their father's goodbye. Wait, what? This story isn't about the husband I lost. It is about the love I gave away and the day I finally decided to take myself back. Stay until the end, and you will understand the quiet power of walking away with dignity even when you have nothing left. The church had always been large. Now it was vast. Every bench stretched away from me, a pale, varnished monument to absence. The thick red carpet, usually muted by shuffling feet, seemed to absorb the light, deepening the silence further. I counted the empty spaces, 214 seats, 214 indictments. I had dressed in Henry's favorite blue-gray, a color he said matched the sea on a calm day. Now I realized I was wearing the color of distance. I kept my gaze fixed on the mahogany island. The closed lid held him, and it held my life. It was a barrier, final and absolute. The casket flowers, a spray of white roses and fading lilies, were beginning to wilt. They had arrived early, perhaps hoping to find company. Now they looked tired. The air was still. It carried the faint, specific scent of old hymnals and cold stone. No perfume, no cologne, no wet wool of a crowd coming in from the rain, just the stillness of a place meant for assembly, but finding none. I listened for the sound of a door opening. I waited for the sound of hurried footsteps. I kept waiting. The silence was not empty. It was pressurized. It weighed on the breastbone, forcing shallow breaths. I watched a mote of dust turn gold in a shaft of high afternoon light. It danced. It was the only thing moving with joy in the entire sanctuary. Then came a sound, mechanical and jarring. The janitor turned on the lights. Not for the service. The service was over. He turned them on for cleaning. The fluorescent tubes hummed, a low, buzzing insult to the solemnity. They bleached the already pale room, stealing the last vestiges of warmth. The janitor, a stout man with a kind, indifferent face, did not see me. He saw an empty room that needed sweeping. He was efficient, moving the long wooden broom across the vast floor, the bristles sounding like dry rain. I was invisible to him. I was part of the furniture now, a grieving, forgotten statue in a vacant hall. I didn't cry. My body refused the release. Grief requires witness, and I had none. Instead, a peculiar clarity set in. It was a chemical change inside the brain turning sorrow into observation. I saw the children's names etched into the memorial plaque near the altar. Camille, Darren, a record of their baptism decades ago, now a mocking list of the missing. I opened my phone. A small, foolish movement. I told myself I was checking the time, but the truth was more desperate. I needed proof. I needed an emergency. No new texts, just the morning's messages. Camille, sorry, Mom, big presentation this afternoon. So stressful. Wish I could be there. Darren, huge client lunch. Can't bail. I'll swing by the cemetery later this week. Hugs. Lies wrapped in professionalism. Excuses served with distant warmth. They had substituted presence with punctuation. But then, the algorithms betrayed them. My social media feed in its endless, cruel scroll offered up a memory from just an hour ago. A friend of a friend, I saw Camille. She was laughing, glass of champagne tilted just so, her face flush with a light I knew was not the sun. A fundraiser, a charity gala, she was dressed in something expensive, her hair perfect, no trace of stress, no trace of grief. A few more taps, Darren. A short, grainy video. He was standing near a barbecue pit, smoke curling around his head, cheering. It wasn't a client lunch. It was a backyard party, a small celebration of nothing important. The camera was not on them. The camera was on their life, and their life was vibrant, loud, and entirely elsewhere. My wedding ring felt suddenly cold, heavy. It had been a symbol of shared warmth, but now it was just a piece of metal absorbing the frigid air of the sanctuary. I ran my thumb over the thin gold, remembering the friction of Henry's calloused hand, the one that had worn its match. That hand, now still, had built everything. The janitor, having swept the aisle once, was now starting his second pass, closer this time. I watched his broom handle move, up, down, relentless and routine, a small engine of indifference in the face of my personal apocalypse. I glanced up. Above the main doors, there it hung, the church clock ticked louder than any prayer. Tick, tock. Each second was a small, sharp hammer blow against the thin membrane of my composure. It wasn't measuring time, it was measuring absence. Tick, the hour of the service. Tock, the minute I realized they would not come. I saw the party light reflecting in Camille's champagne glass. I heard the cheap laughter in Darren's grainy video. The contrast was a physical wound. My children had weighed their father's final silence against the fleeting noise of a Tuesday afternoon, and they had chosen the noise. It was not negligence. It was choice. I had spent my life building a moral shelter for them. I had lined the walls with sacrifice and paid the mortgage with devotion. Now I realized I had not built a home, but a launching pad. They had lifted off successfully and never looked back at the fuel they discarded. The realization arrived not with a scream, but with an echo. The echo of Henry's silence, amplified by the emptiness around me. This was the moral wound. Not Henry's death. That was nature. This was the deliberate social abandonment by the people who owed their very breath to our shared history. I closed my phone. The screen went dark. It was better to be in the dark, where the betrayals were not lit by a 100-watt bulb. I slid the phone into my pocket. It made a soundless thud. The janitor finished the main aisle. He looked towards the front, perhaps noticing the single immobile figure for the first time. He hesitated. I knew he wanted to ask if I was leaving soon. But I didn't move. I remained seated in the front pew, the only one occupied. I was performing a vigil for a broken contract, for a love that had become invisible, and for the silent question that now filled the entire vast space. What is a life built on sacrifice worth if the beneficiaries refuse to show up for the final accounting? The children's absence was a seed of conflict, quietly planted. It was a silence that demanded a response, but that response would not be loud. It would not be hysterical. It would be clear.
I understood then that my duty to the past was finished. My duty to myself was just beginning. I simply sat, breathing in the cold air, feeling the profound, desolate reality of the empty church. The clock ticked on. The funeral finished quickly. It had no choice. A sermon designed to take 40 minutes had withered into 12. The pastor, a young man named Michael, whose face was still smooth with unearned sorrow, moved through the liturgy with professional competence. He read verses about the promise of resurrection, about the peace that passes understanding, words that required the counterpoint of human grief to sound true. But there was no counterpoint, only silence. His voice, gentle and kind, felt misplaced. It was a formal sound in a deeply personal vacuum. He was speaking into an empty chamber, delivering comfort to an audience of one. When he spoke of Henry's rich legacy and loving family, the lies were not malicious. They were merely routine, generic words intended for a full house, now bouncing off the empty wood. I watched Pastor Michael close his Bible. The snap of the leather cover was the loudest sound of the entire morning. It was the signal. The formal ceremony was done. He looked at me, his eyes full of that practiced, gentle pity reserved for the recently widowed. He offered his hand. I took it, feeling the damp heat of his palm. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Hayes." "Thank you, Pastor," I whispered. My voice felt brittle, unused. He did not ask where the children were. He did not ask if I needed anything. He understood the transaction. His duty was complete. He gave me a final nod, a blessing packaged as a goodbye, and then he retreated. He walked backward a few steps, then turned, his dark suit vanishing quickly through the side door leading to the sacristy. Then there was only Henry and me. The janitor, having finished his sweeping, had also gone. The fluorescent lights still hummed, harsh and white. The mahogany island of the casket seemed to grow in size, demanding all the air in the room. I rose slowly. My legs had forgotten the process of standing. I approached the casket, my footsteps a slow, soft rhythm against the red carpet. 1, 2, 3. I reached the lip of the wood. The varnish was thick, gleaming. It reflected the white lilies above it, but the light was fractured, broken. I saw my own reflection in the surface, a pale woman in a blue-gray dress. Distant. I placed my hand on the cold wood. It was not a gesture of grief, but of possession. This was my last physical moment with the half-century of my life. My fingers traced the grain. Each line of the wood was perfectly smooth, perfectly finished. I thought of Henry's hands, rough, calloused, perpetually marked by the mill dust. The contrast was a final ironic cruelty. He was now held in a vessel more refined and untouched than he ever had been in life. I leaned in. The lilies smelled sweet, overpowering, a cloying sweetness that was trying too hard to hide the smell of decay. I had saved a small moment for this. A secret, unscripted goodbye that was not for the pastor or the children. It was just for us. I spoke, my voice barely vibrating in the silent air. "They didn't come, Henry." The sentence was not a question or a complaint. It was a fact whispered into the void, a confession of failure, but whose failure? They had parties. I closed my eyes. I could see Henry's face in the darkness behind my lids, the tired lines around his eyes, the slight, crooked smile he always saved for me. I let them. I enabled them. I let them believe that the world moved on their schedule. Silence answered. Henry could not absolve me. His stillness was a final, immovable judgment. I reached for my left hand. I focused on the gold band. It had been part of my skin for 50 years. Now, in the stark white light, I examined it. The gold was worn thin, not in any one place, but uniformly, softly eroded by the constant friction of laundry, kneading dough, scrubbing floors, and holding two tiny hands that had long since grown too proud to hold back. It was a circle of completion, but also a circle of burden. I felt the sudden immense weight of the wedding band. Before, it had been a comfort, a connection. Now, with Henry gone and the children elsewhere, it felt like a shackle to an empty commitment. It was cold, a conductor of the deep institutional chill. I thought of the promises the pastor had read, to have and to hold until death do us part. Death had done its part. It was finished. What I had not realized until that exact moment, standing alone before the casket, was that the children's absence meant my part was finished too. My duty to Henry was done. My duty to the children's well-being, their survival, their happiness, that was finished the moment they consciously chose to prioritize a barbecue over his final silence. I lifted my hand, pulling the ring off slowly. The skin beneath was pale and untouched, a small, shocking band of vulnerability. I held the ring, examining the minute scratches and dents, each a small record of a forgotten Tuesday, a crisis overcome, a debt paid. I stood there, the gold disc resting on my palm, realizing I held not a memory but a relic, a piece of history that no longer defined the present. I did not put it on the other hand. I did not drop it into the casket. I simply slipped it into the small, hidden, zippered pocket inside my purse. A gesture of finality. A decision to store the symbol, to acknowledge the weight, but to remove it from my person. The weight of that metal was replaced by the tension of a question. The church, now entirely silent, began to feel like a tomb for my past self. I remembered the pastor's words, kind, generic words that floated in the high air. They were words of faith and continuity. They spoke of a journey's end and a new beginning. They were meant to console, but they only emphasized the loneliness. He had said Henry was at peace. I wanted to ask him, and what about the living? Where is my peace? The silence was the only answer. It gathered around me, thick and heavy, like the fog rolling in off the Great Lakes. It pressed the question into my skull. What do you do when the final act of devotion is met with utter indifference? I walked slowly down the aisle again. My footsteps were a fraction faster now, a subtle internal shift in momentum. I did not look back at the Mahogany Island. That chapter was closed. I passed the 214 empty seats. I imagined the children there. Camille checking her phone under the pew, Darren fidgeting, already planning his escape to the barbecue. Their imagined presence was almost worse than their actual absence. It was a vision of what they had become, adults who could not give 60 minutes to the man who gave them everything. I stopped at the massive oak doors. They were the color of forgotten things. I realized I was left with silence and questions. The silence was the children's answer to my life. The questions were my answer to theirs. How did the flowers wilt so fast? Was the sound of the clock truly louder than my heart? And what now without the ring, without the title of wife, without the identity of mother who sacrifices? I placed a gloved hand on the cold brass door handle. The metal bit through the wool. It was a new kind of cold, a cold of clarity. I pushed the door open, not with fury, but with quiet, profound weariness. The light outside was blinding. The harsh afternoon sun hit the clean white stone of the church facade.
I stepped out. I did not pause on the steps. I did not turn to see the empty hall one last time. The wait was gone. The contract was terminated. I was not fleeing. I was simply beginning the long, slow, quiet walk toward a different life. A life where I would no longer beg for love. This was the quiet goodbye. Not to Henry, but to the self I used to be. The door swung shut behind me with a gentle, definitive sigh. The cold of the church brass, the quiet dread of the present day, it cracked open when I touched the door. Stepping into the blinding sunlight of the cemetery felt less like walking outside and more like falling backward in time. Grief has that specific gravity. It pulls you to the beginning to measure the distance of the fall. The light was sharper then. It was 1968. I was 21, a girl who believed that hard work was the only currency the world respected, and that love was a luxury reserved for the lucky. I met Henry Hayes in the parking lot of the Community College Annex. It was a dusty, unpaved strip behind the main building, smelling faintly of gravel and exhaust. I was fumbling with the flat tire. My fingers were already black with grease and frustration. I was late for my evening class, a bookkeeping course meant to secure my escape. He did not offer to change it. He simply watched for a moment, his hands in the pockets of his denim jacket, the way a truly competent person observes a task before deciding the best method. "You're doing it wrong," he said, his voice flat, without judgment. I looked up. He was taller than I expected. His face was structured, serious, already carrying the faint lines of concentration that would deepen into kindness over the next 50 years. His eyes were the color of damp riverstone. "I am doing it the only way I know," I snapped back, pushing a strand of hair behind my ear. He smiled then. It was not a grand gesture, but a small, necessary correction of his lips. It transformed the seriousness into something steady. Steady, safe love. He took a length of scrap wood from the bed of his beat-up Ford pickup truck, a truck already showing the honest wear of a working man, and showed me how to wedge it beneath the frame before jacking. He explained the geometry of the weight. He worked without rushing, without talking too much. He taught. He didn't condescend. We finished the tire in silence. My hands were clean. His were now stained. When I thanked him, he looked at my books, the worn spine of the accounting manual, and then back at my face. "What's your name?" "Eleanor," I said. "Henry," he replied. "I work at the mill, night shift, learning welding during the day." It was not a boast. It was simply a statement of his trajectory. Moving forward, slowly, with intention. That was the core of Henry. He was not a dream. He was a plan. Our courtship was built on shared practicality. No grand gestures involving expensive flowers or late-night drives to the coast. Our dates were the gaps between his welding classes and my library shifts. We would meet in the park across from the mill. The air there always tasted metallic, industrial. We'd sit on a bench and share a thermos of coffee, often cold, and talk about numbers, how much we had saved, what the next month's rent would be, the cost of a good, reliable refrigerator. It sounds dull now described this way, but in those conversations there was an exhilarating sense of building. Every penny accounted for was a nail hammered into the foundation of a shared life. He didn't bring me wildflowers after every night shift, but once he brought a piece of polished steel, cool and smooth. He had shaped it into a tiny, perfect bird. "He won't wilt," he said, offering it to me in his palm. It was the most poetic thing anyone had ever given me, a declaration that our love was meant to be industrial, permanent, and resistant to the soft decay of time. I kept that steel bird on my bookshelf for 50 years. We were fierce about small joys, a successful negotiation at the used car lot, a bonus at the end of the fiscal quarter, the precise, comforting click of the latch on our first joint savings account book.
We married 18 months later. The wedding ring he placed on my finger was not the one I had just put in my purse. It was a simple, slightly thicker band, which he had traded up for after his first raise. It felt warm, and it felt earned. Our early struggles were the mortar that held us together. They were not tragic, they were relentless. The cold floor of the first apartment, the noise of the mill permeating our sleep, the constant hum of anxiety over an unexpected medical bill. We established a kind of internal, unspoken rhythm. I would wake before dawn, make his thermos, and check his boots for wear. He would leave me a scribbled note on the counter, a quick weather forecast, or a simple 3-word instruction: hold the fort. I worked at the local library, stacking and sorting. The library was clean, quiet, a cool balm against the heat of the world. I loved the precise, ordered silence of the stacks. I also took an extra job tutoring high school math, spending evenings navigating fractions and algebra for bored teenagers. Henry, meanwhile, took every overtime shift available. We were 2 engines running on parallel tracks, our destinations perfectly aligned: security. I would come home after tutoring, exhausted, my head filled with numbers, and find him already asleep, sometimes still in his work shirt, smelling faintly of smoke and honest effort. I would carefully remove his boots. I never woke him. The shared effort was a silent, stubborn hope. On Sundays, we had our ritual. We would walk to the small bakery on the corner. We could afford 1 loaf of bread, still hot from the oven. We would tear it apart with our hands on the walk home, eating in silence. The smell of yeast and warm crust was the scent of our wealth. It was a simple but fiercely mutual existence. We knew the value of everything because we had labored for its acquisition. The television set was bought piece by piece, the threadbare sofa that held the shape of our 2 bodies, the shared, stubborn belief that if we simply kept moving, we would eventually outrun the lack we felt in our childhoods. Then came Camille. A shock, a beautiful interruption to the careful bookkeeping of our lives. Her birth was a pivot point. The budgeting stopped being about us and started being about her. The need to protect her from the cold floor and the metallic air of the mill became an obsession. I cut my tutoring, but took on night shifts at a small diner. The grease-soaked air, the clatter of plates, the hurried demands of tired drivers. It was the antithesis of the library's quiet order, but the pay was better. Henry never asked me to stop. He never complained about the cold supper or the exhausted silence in our bed. He just rubbed the small of my back before he left for the mill, a pressure that said, "We are still 2 engines." When Darren arrived 3 years later, the budget tightened again. My hands ached constantly. My feet rarely rested. I bought the children their first pair of brand new, unscuffed shoes with the tip money saved over 4 months. I didn't sacrifice my time. I invested it. I poured my years into the foundation of their lives, hoping they would be able to build higher, in brighter air than Henry and I had. I remember one night, standing at the kitchen sink,
washing dishes until my skin felt raw. Henry came up behind me. He wrapped his arms around my waist, his mill-stained hands resting on the porcelain edge of the sink. He murmured into my hair, "We'll make it, Elle." I closed my eyes. "I know," I replied. It wasn't a question we were asking. It was a promise we were keeping. A promise that we would be the hard soil so they could become tall, beautiful trees. The twist hint was already there, folded into the fabric of our devotion. We built a life so strong, so self-sufficient, that the ones we built it for never learned how to carry a burden or how to see the strength of the foundation beneath their own feet. I remember thinking that night, they will never have to work this hard for love. They will never have to wait for the next paycheck. They will just be, and that will be enough. It was the moment I cemented my fate. I didn't realize that by removing struggle, I had also removed visibility. I had made my effort silent, and silent love eventually becomes expected. That love, the foundation she helped lay, a beautiful, quiet, and ultimately self-effacing love. It was built on the premise that the children would carry the memory of the struggle. I was wrong. The memory of the hot, yeast-scented bread and Henry's calloused hand at the kitchen sink faded, replaced by the relentless, grinding reality of the next 2 decades. Love, we quickly learned, was not a cushion. Love was a hammer. It demanded constant labor to maintain the structure of the future we promised our children. My library shifts became the cool, quiet anchor of my day. I loved the precise order, the Dewey Decimal System that placed every fact into a predictable, rightful slot. It was a beautiful contrast to the chaos of managing a household on zero margin. In the stacks, the air was clean, the silence respected. I moved among the history and literature of the world, but my own life was still being written in the margins. My salary was steady, reliable. It was the foundation for the mortgage and the utilities. It was the quiet, unseen birder holding up the house. But 2 children need more than a girder. They need light, air, and the illusion of ease. I added extra jobs, a mosaic of small, tiring incomes. I proofread local legal documents late at night, the yellow glow of the desk lamp turning my dining room table into a makeshift office. I worked as a cashier at a convenience store on Saturday mornings, trading the scent of old paper for the overwhelming, cloying smell of packaged coffee and stale donuts.
Henry, meanwhile, was buried in the mill. The mill was loud, hot, and unforgiving. It was a brutal environment of metal and fire, where a mistake meant a lost finger or a lost life. He worked the furnace, turning raw ore into something useful. His skin was always dry, his knuckles swollen. He came home smelling of ozone and exhaustion. The scent was industrial, but to me it was the smell of absolute devotion. He was a man who spoke in deeds. His love language was overtime. We entered a phase of permanent, subtle sacrifice. We were not poor, but we were perpetually stretched taut. Every purchase was a calculation, every spare dollar a negotiation between immediate necessity and future security. The budget was a map of our fear. We stopped going out to the Saturday evening movies. We cut the cable television. The small acts of self-care, a new pair of shoes for me, a fishing reel for Henry, were dismissed with a shrug and a shared, silent look of agreement. Not yet. I remember the day I sold my grandmother's brooch. It was a small piece, silver filigree with a tiny cloudy opal. It was one of the few pieces of true memory I owned. We needed the money for Camille's school trip, a mandatory history excursion that felt crucially important for her sense of belonging. The pawn shop was cold and bright. The man behind the counter handled the brooch with dull indifference. He offered a number. I didn't haggle. I simply nodded. Walking out, I didn't feel sadness over the loss of the silver. I felt the deep, profound satisfaction of a debt paid, of a bridge built for my daughter's future. Selling keepsakes was not about financial destitution. It was about the transference of value. I was trading a beautiful, inert past for a necessary, dynamic future. I didn't tell Henry. He wouldn't have allowed it. That day, I learned to keep certain sacrifices silent. The truth was, my small, everyday acts of surrender became a second, invisible layer of the family's foundation. Henry's equivalent came in the form of his truck. That beat-up Ford pickup, the one with the scrap wood and the honest wear, was slowly cannibalized for parts. He kept it running years past its expiration, pouring his own labor into the engine, refusing a new loan. He loved that truck. It was a vessel of independence. Yet, he allowed it to become a symbol of tightened budgets, of deferral. Our life was built on shared effort and stubborn hope. The house was not grand, but it was pristine. It was the only thing we could completely control. The lawn was cut precisely. The curtains were always clean. It was a fortress of order against the external threat of financial collapse. We communicated in glances, in the choreography of a life perfectly intertwined. I knew the sound of his tired cough, the rhythm of his breathing when he was truly stressed. He knew how my back felt after a double shift, and he would simply leave a hot water bottle where I habitually sat. There were moments of genuine, deep joy, brief explosions of warmth in the perpetual cool, the children's recitals, Camille, serious and focused, playing the piano with tiny hands. Darren, loud and chaotic, scoring the winning run in a Little League game. In those moments, we would look across the crowd at each other, and the meaning of the struggle became sharp and clear. This is why, the look would say. This is why the clock is ignored, why the hands ache. But the children, wrapped in the safe cocoon we provided, could not see the furnace. They saw the warmth, the light, and the security. They did not see the coal we shoveled, the sleep we lost. They were raised to appreciate the result, not the cost. This was the quiet, dangerous success of our parenting. We shielded them too completely from the geography of struggle. I made the home out of stubborn hope, yes, but stubborn hope requires perpetual replenishment. We never admitted to being exhausted. We never allowed ourselves to be sick. We believed that if we just kept moving, the love we produced would automatically flow back to us. We were wrong about the transaction. We forgot to teach them how to pay the unseen debt of devotion. We taught them only how to receive. The years blurred into a relentless, exhausting middle ground. No peaks, no valleys, just the flat gray landscape of sustained effort, the kind of life that becomes invisible in the retelling. The house, once filled with the controlled chaos of young children, began to empty itself. Slowly, subtly, the sound pressure dropped. It began not with the dramatic slam of a door, but with the quiet sound of a phone vibrating in a teenager's pocket. The children started to grow up and away.
Camille leaves for college. She chose a university 3 states away, a place with ivy-covered buildings and a heritage we only knew from books. We financed it with the careful, relentless saving of 2 decades. It was the price of our hope. When she came home the first time, she was different. Her clothes were sharper, her language was clipped. She spoke of things we didn't understand, abstract concepts, professors with tenure, and friends with names that sounded like old money. She was polite, exquisitely so, too polite. She no longer saw the home we had built as a sanctuary from the world, but as a monument to its limitations.
"It's very sweet, Mom," she said one afternoon, looking at my steel bird on the shelf. "But you really should update the curtains. They're so heavy." The word sweet landed with the precise, sharp sting of a surgical incision. It was a word that contained condescension wrapped in affection. She didn't mean to be cruel. She meant to establish distance. She was staking a claim to her new world, and our old world was simply collateral damage. That was the first time I felt the slow erosion of appreciation. It wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative, like dust collecting on a window pane, obscuring the view one particle at a time. Darren drifted toward parties. He didn't have Camille's sharp focus. He was loud, charismatic, and drawn to easy validation. He found his identity not in effort, but in attention. He traded the earnest sweat of Little League for the quick manufactured camaraderie of the night. He took a part-time job, but the money vanished instantly, on expensive shoes, on gasoline for drives to nowhere, on buying rounds for a fleeting audience. His chair at the dinner table was often empty. The food I cooked, perfected over years, cooled quickly beneath the silent clock. When I asked where he had been, his answers were vague, delivered with a casual lack of eye contact that was its own form of cruelty. "Out, Mom. Just out." The silence that followed was heavy with subtle disrespect. Henry and I would eat, staring past the empty plate, avoiding each other's gaze. The quiet conversation revolved only around the immediate and the practical. Bills, the weather, Henry's blood pressure. We stopped discussing the children's futures because their present was too hard to name. We became guardians of their potential rather than participants in their lives. The house became a waiting room. We waited for Camille's calls, which came on schedule, but always with a slight impatience in her voice, as if she were racing a meter. We waited for Darren to stumble home. The low thud of his bedroom door was a relief that he was safe, but a fresh wound that he was distant. The great lie of our parenting was the belief that success was a one-way transfer. We thought if we gave them a path of least resistance, they would turn back and thank the cartographers. They didn't. They assumed the road had always been smooth. I remembered the time Henry's old friend Jack came over for a beer. Jack was rugged, still working the floor at the mill. He noticed the new furniture in the living room, the quiet order. "You did well, Henry," Jack said, raising his can. "You gave them a life." Henry nodded, but his eyes were fixed on the back door, waiting for Darren to come home. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. We hadn't given them a life. We had given them a platform, and now that they were high above us, the view had changed. The erosion was relentless. Camille started calling only when she needed advice that served her new life, how to word a professional email, how to negotiate a salary, never just to talk about a rainy Tuesday or an old memory. They stopped calling. Birthdays came with quick texts.
When Henry was hospitalized briefly with a minor heart scare, I called them both. Camille promised she would look into flights. Darren promised he would try to leave work early. Neither arrived. They sent flowers, a huge, tasteless bouquet that choked the small hospital room with scent. The flowers were loud. The children were silent. Henry, looking small and defeated in the white sheets, just shook his head slightly when I mentioned the flowers. "They're busy, Elle," he murmured. But I saw the flicker of pain in his eyes, a pain worse than the one in his chest. It was the pain of a foundation finally recognized as unnecessary. The house was completely silent one night. Henry was asleep. Camille was back at school. Darren was out late again. I walked through the rooms, the kitchen, where I had cooked 10,000 meals, the living room, where we had watched movies every Friday. I saw the indentations on the sofa, still there from the weight of Henry and me. I stood in the hall, near the entrance. I could hear the refrigerator running, a soft, self-sufficient hum. I could hear the house settling, a creak in the floorboards. I looked at the space where the children's coats used to hang, where their muddy shoes used to gather. Now, it was clean, orderly. And then it hit me, a moment of quiet, devastating truth. I wasn't waiting for them to return. I was waiting for them to see me. I realized I had spent 20 years being the engine of this house, invisible, essential, constant. And now the engines were idling, but the ship had sailed without them. I stood there, surrounded by the beautiful, expensive proof of my sacrifice, and understood the terrifying cost. I remembered the first time I felt invisible, in my own house. It wasn't when they failed to call. It was when I stood in the quiet of their absence and realized I had been so silent, I'd forgotten how to make noise. The house didn't need me anymore. It simply existed because I had built it to last.
The last of the warmth of the memory faded, and the cold dread of the empty church returned. The cycle of erosion was complete. We had transitioned from fierce mutual love to quiet, unappreciated expectation. This emptiness was the new atmosphere. The cold indifference of the children had been a gradual thaw, a slow melt of commitment. But the catalyst for that final, deep abandonment was something entirely external, a force we couldn't fight, the closing of the mill. It was the event that fundamentally altered Henry, and in doing so, changed the air in our home forever. I remember the day he walked in. The front door opened not with his usual sturdy push, but with a tentative drift. He stood in the hallway, covered head to toe in the ghost of his last shift, the gray industrial dust that smelled of burnt metal and years of loyalty. He did not immediately wipe his feet. He simply stood there, a still figure in a suddenly vast space. "They closed it, Elle." The words were not loud. They were quiet, almost ashamed. He didn't have to say what they closed. The mill was more than a job. It was the foundation of his identity, the source of his pride, the steady engine that had paid for the shoes and the tuition. His face was drawn, yet peaceful. It was the peace of total collapse. The man who had spoken in deeds, whose love language was overtime, now had no deeds left to perform. Shame replaced his voice. Henry Hayes, the man built on work, had been declared redundant. The house immediately absorbed the silence of his presence. Before, he was a steady sound. The clock in, the clock out, the low whistle from the garage. Now, he was a constant, muted echo in the rooms. He would sit in his chair, not watching television, not reading, but simply sitting. His hands, the hands that had polished the steel bird, that had fixed the truck,
were still. He became meticulously focused on the useless, sharpening kitchen knives until the blades were thin and dangerous, cleaning the garage until the concrete was immaculate, oiling hinges that never squeaked. He performed a labor without purpose. It was his way of protesting the forced stillness. The house became a library again, but without the welcome order. It was a space saturated with unspoken panic. We kept the mill's collapse a secret from the children. Camille was in her final, critical year of college. Darren was drifting through his first tumultuous years out of high school. We could not risk the seismic shift of reality interrupting their climb. We maintained the illusion of stability. The shame was not his failure to provide. It was the failure to sustain the promise we had made, that the work would always hold the line. I immediately pivoted. There was no discussion, no argument, only clarity. I was the financial engine now. I was the one who had to make noise. My morning library shifts continued, the quiet order a lifeline of sanity. But the evenings became a frantic blur. I picked up every extra shift the convenience store offered, the graveyard shifts, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., the hours when the clientele changed from tired parents to desperate shadows. The light outside was always dark, the counter always sticky. I worked until my uniform smelled not of industrial dust, but of old fry grease and bad decisions. I became an expert at running on exhaustion. I would finish the store shift at 6 a.m., drive home, prepare a silent, perfect breakfast for Henry, and be at the library by 9 a.m. The hours were my defense. They filled the space where fear wanted to live. I didn't ask Henry for help. The shame was too palpable. Asking him to find some small, temporary lesser job would have been asking him to admit the finality of his loss. I protected his dignity with my own exhaustion. This was the core of my mistake, the one that wounded the family structure. By stepping into the financial void so completely and silently, I solidified my role as the invisible engine, and I confirmed Henry's feeling of uselessness. I picked up extra shifts. The household rhythm changes. The rhythm became mine alone, a staccato pulse of keys turning in locks, and the soft sound of my foot pressing the clutch pedal, moving from one low-paying task to a next. The children noticed the change, but they misinterpreted the signs. Camille came home for Christmas break. She saw the new weariness in my eyes, the faint purple shadows I couldn't hide with powder. She saw Henry's silence. She didn't ask what was wrong. She asked what was going on. "Things are tight, Elle," Henry finally admitted one evening, his voice a low monotone. "Oh, I know things are tight," complained casually, scrolling on her new smartphone. "But Dad, you have to be proactive. You can't just sit around. Have you updated your resume? You need to network. It's all about the hustle now, not loyalty." The words struck me like small, polished stones. They were the language of her new world, a world where loyalty was a mistake and the past was irrelevant. She spoke of Henry's 50 years of devotion to the mill as if it were a tactical error. She could not see the shame. She only saw the lack of activity. Henry flinched, not physically, but internally. I saw the muscle near his jaw tighten. He simply stood up and walked into the garage, closing the door softly. Home stopped being a place of shared effort. Home became a place of survival, not celebration. The food was still cooked. The house was still clean. The bills were still paid. The surface was pristine. But beneath the surface, a new cold current flowed. Anxiety replaced the old stubborn hope. We celebrated holidays, but the laughter felt forced, like something we were paying for with borrowed joy. Camille would arrive with gifts that were expensive and useless. A silk scarf for me, a high-tech kitchen gadget for Henry. Gifts meant to signal her success, not her affection. Darren, meanwhile, would simply ask for money. A loan for a car payment. A loan for an unexpected bill. a perpetual, low-level financial extraction that we never discussed in front of Camille, who would have loudly judged his lack of proactivity. I always gave him the money, not because I was enabling him, though that was part of it, but because giving him the money felt like giving him an anchor. It was the only way I knew how to keep him attached to the shore. It was a transaction of control, masked as love. Henry noticed. He said nothing during the day, but one night, lying in the darkness, he spoke into the blackness. "He shouldn't need us, Elle. Not like this." "He's finding his way," I whispered back, a reflexive defense. "He is finding the path of least resistance, the one we paved." I said nothing more. I listened to his breathing. He was right. But I was too tired to dismantle the road. I was too busy laying down my extra shifts to shore up the structure against the layoff's financial threat. The house began to collect Henry's unspoken grief. The air grew thick with it. He never raged. He never drank. He simply dwindled. His posture changed, a subtle rounding of the shoulders, as if he were trying to occupy less space in the world. He started retreating to the small, overgrown garden behind the house. He built a potting bench from reclaimed lumber, a small act of creation. He began growing tomatoes and herbs, nurturing things that had a simple, honest life cycle. I would watch him from the kitchen window. He was completely focused, his hands moving with quiet, careful dignity. He found solace in the simple, predictable contract of the earth. Give water and sun, and you receive growth. A contract the children had long since forgotten. The garden became his refuge. It was the only place where his efforts were clearly valued. My shift was equally clear. I became the fortress. I stood guard over the finances, the mortgage, the illusion. I put on the cashier's apron, absorbing the late-night loneliness, and ensured that nothing changed on the children's radar. The rhythm of my life became a series of small, rhythmic actions. The swipe of the debit card at the convenience store, the soft turning of a page at the library, the quiet opening and closing of my purse. Each action was a silent, exhausting proof that the house was still afloat. We had bought the children's security at the cost of honesty. We had paid for their freedom with our own invisibility. The emotional price was steep, but we thought we could afford it. The silence that fell over our house after the layoff was heavy. It was the sound of a family system under immense, sustained pressure. It was the quiet, profound realization that the foundation was now composed entirely of my will, and that Henry's proud voice had been replaced by the quiet, meticulous grief of a man with nothing left to build. Camille's transformation was silent, completed not with a battle, but with an introduction. When she graduated from the ivy-covered college we had sacrificed for, she returned home not with gratitude, but with a fiancé named Simon. Simon was not built from mill dust or library quiet. He was constructed of expensive, tailored wool and a profound, effortless sense of entitlement. He saw our house not as a home, but as an antique. He saw Henry not as a provider, but as a man who needed an updated resume. Camille's new world demanded a specific aesthetic, a precise kind of currency. Our love, simple and worn thin by decades of use, was no longer accepted. It was replaced by the need for appearances and status. The wedding was large, white, and meticulously curated. Henry and I felt like polite, necessary props in a scene that was otherwise dedicated to signaling wealth. We watched Camille float down the aisle, beautiful and untouchable, and realized she was marrying not a man, but a continuation of the platform we had built for her. Simon's family spoke in low, modulated voices, discussing stock portfolios and summer homes. We spoke of rain and blood pressure. After the marriage, the distance solidified. Camille was a successful young professional, living in a city that felt 1,000 miles away, not physically, but spiritually. Her visits became ritualistic, rare and scheduled weeks in advance. They were not spontaneous rushes of affection, they were appointments. She would arrive with Simon, and the very air in our small living room would grow tight, as if trying to accommodate their expansive worldviews. She didn't ask me to cook her favorite meal. She asked me to use the expensive French enameled pot she had given me for Christmas, a gift intended to upgrade my tools, not celebrate my cooking. The conversations were clinical. She would recount her busy schedule, the demanding clients, the impossible social calendar. She spoke of stress as a badge of honor. She never asked about my library work. She never asked about Henry's garden. Those things were small, invisible. She was polite, always polite. But politeness is the velvet glove on the hand of indifference.
I remember one visit, standing in the kitchen, making coffee with my old humming percolator. Camille was standing stiffly near the counter, scrolling through a gallery of photos on her phone. "You know, Mom," she said without looking up, "the therapist I saw for my stress actually had a few things to say about my relationship with you." The word "you" felt sharp. "Oh?" I asked, my voice flat, holding the percolator steady. "She said that your generation, you created such a culture of sacrifice that it makes it impossible for us to feel successful." She paused, finally looking up, her eyes bright and analytical. "She said you talk about your hard work too much, that it makes us feel like we owe you, and that's not healthy." She was smiling, delivering a psychoanalysis of my entire life's effort. It was a perfectly constructed piece of language designed to eliminate guilt by converting it into my own emotional pathology. I put the percolator down. It hissed, a soft, angry sound. "I don't talk about my hard work, Camille. I just do it," I replied. "Exactly," she said, nodding briskly. "The silent martyrdom. It's a very old pattern." In that moment, I realized the vast, unbridgeable chasm. She had been taught, professionally, to talk herself out of the quiet debt of devotion. She had replaced affection with vocabulary. Love is talked out of her daughter. The social currency of wellness and therapy speak had successfully voided the contract of motherhood. She didn't need forgiveness. She needed intellectual justification for her absence. Henry was the greatest casualty of this new era. He was invisible to Camille's new world. He was the product of loyalty, and loyalty was now seen as a weakness. When Camille was planning her first large social gathering, a sophisticated dinner party, she asked me for a favor. "I need you to come over and help me organize the kitchen the day before," she instructed, her voice light, efficient. "I'd be happy to. Henry can come too. He can help with the heavy lifting." A pause. A subtle intake of breath, a microsecond of hesitation that spoke volumes. "Oh, Mom, no, I really just need you. Henry, he's a little rough around the edges, you know? And Simon is bringing his boss. I just need everything to be very polished." Visits became rare for Henry. He was not polished. He did not fit the aesthetic. He was the living, breathing, mill-dust-stained proof of the foundation that they wanted to forget. He was a piece of the history that did not align with the modern narrative of their success. I went alone to organize her kitchen. I spent 8 hours ensuring every expensive wine glass was sparkling, every cabinet perfectly aligned. I was her invisible service staff. When Simon's boss arrived, I was already gone, erased from the scene, leaving behind only the perfect, effortless appearance. I performed this labor without complaint, but I watched Henry when I returned. He was sitting in the garden, watering his tomatoes. He didn't ask how the party went. He simply looked up at me.
and I saw the deep, quiet knowledge in his eyes. She chose the appearance over me. The tension in our house became the constant hum of the refrigerator, low, unchanging, but always there. We were no longer partners in the struggle, but guardians of a fragile, expensive illusion for two people who had already moved on. The narrator's efforts go unnoticed. They were not meant to be noticed. They were meant to be utilized and then neatly forgotten. The emotional drain was not from the work, but from the realization that my own child was using me as a tool to protect her image. The distance was complete. Affection had been fully replaced by the smooth, cold surface of utility. If Camille's betrayal was delivered with surgical precision and polite detachment, Darren's was a constant, messy hemorrhage. He was the opposite of his sister, chaotic, loud, and utterly dependent. He didn't seek status, he sought comfort. He saw his parents not as emotional guides, but as an endlessly flowing, reliable financial backstop. His needs always arrived wrapped in a promise of imminent success. The job he was about to get, the life he was about to start. The future was always 10 minutes away, and it always required cash up front. This created a deep, festering conflict between Henry and I. Henry, the man of work and earned value, saw Darren's requests as moral failures. They were violations of the core principle of his life. He is a man, Elle. He needs to feel the consequence of a bad decision. That's how we learned. He's struggling, Henry, I would reply, fiercely. He just needs a little push. We gave him the best start. We can't let him fall back now. My defense was driven by an older, more primal anxiety. I feared Darren's chaos. I feared the shame of having a child who couldn't launch. His requests were a burden, but they were also a kind of proof. He still needed me. He was still connected.
So I bypassed Henry. I would withdraw the money from my library or convenience store paycheck, my money, the one that kept us afloat after the layoff, and slip it to Darren in a crisp white envelope when Henry was in the garden. Darren's repeated loans became a secret transaction between mother and son, an act of subversion against Henry's rigid morality. I was protecting Darren's comfort, but I was destroying Henry's dignity. The crucial mistake happened 3 years before Henry's death. It was the moment I chose my fear over my partnership. Darren had totaled his car, driving home late from a party. He was unhurt, but the car was gone. He called me from the police station, frantic and tearful. It was the most vulnerable I had heard him sound in years. He needed money for the deductible, for the insurance, and for a temporary car. An enormous sum that would require dipping into the small emergency fund Henry had stubbornly guarded since the layoff. Money earmarked for a necessary but expensive roof repair. Henry was furious. His quiet grief finally erupted. "No, Eleanor, this is it. He needs to face this. He needs to call the bank. He needs to tell them he is reckless. This is the consequence he has earned." Henry stood in the living room, his hands trembling. He rarely raised his voice. When he did, the air went thin. I faced him, my own resolve hardened by panic. I could not bear the thought of Darren navigating that shame. I saw my own younger self in him, terrified of failure. I saw the fragile boy who had clung to my apron strings. "You don't understand, Henry. He'll spiral. He'll lose everything. He is not like you. He is not strong enough for that lesson right now." The words were meant to defend Darren, but they were a brutal indictment of Henry's character. "Not strong enough?" Henry repeated, his voice dropping back to a devastating whisper. "You think I built this life on weakness, Elle? I built it on standing up when it would have been easier to spiral." I went to the bedroom, pulled the checkbook from the hiding spot, and wrote the check. I signed my name, forging the final word. I once sided with a child over her husband, a choice that wounded her partner. When I came back out, Henry was gone. I found him hours later, sitting on the potting bench in the garden, covered in dirt. He was not working. He was just sitting, the shovel hanging loose in his hand. He did not look at the check. He did not look at me. The roof needs fixing, Al. It'll leak this winter. I had fixed Darren's temporary crisis, but I had guaranteed the leak in our permanent structure. I had purchased Darren's temporary relief at the cost of Henry's trust. The decision to enable Darren was rooted in love, but it was an act of profound disrespect to the man who was my partner. Henry never brought it up again. The subject of Darren's loans became a silent, toxic patch of ground between us. We spoke around it. We avoided the eye contact that might lead to confession or conflict. I had defended the child who was absent over the man who was present, and now at the funeral, Henry's dignified silence, the silence of the coffin, was the final, immovable realization that I had betrayed his principles, and in doing so had wounded the very moral structure of our partnership. The shame of that decision haunts me now. It is not the empty pews that break me. It is the memory of Henry's shoulders slumped on the potting bench, realizing his 50 years of principles had been overruled by my momentary fear. I had wanted to be a hero to my son, and instead, I had become an accomplice to his eventual abandonment. The silence that now separates the living from the dead is nothing compared to the silence I created between Henry and me in that final, necessary conversation we never had. I have now completed Chapter 7 and Chapter 8, maintaining the tone and word count while delivering the necessary emotional beats of Camille's calculating detachment and the moral error of enabling Darren, which wounded Henry. I left the empty church and stepped into the stark white heat of the afternoon. The silence followed me out, clinging to the wool of my coat. The only sound was the distant rumble of the hearse engine idling patiently at the curb. It was a vehicle of finality, waiting to complete its duty. I walked to my car. It was Henry's old sedan, meticulously clean, parked alone in the vast, empty parking lot. My car, like the pew I had just vacated, was an island. There were no other vehicles to join the procession. No second car, no third. The silence of the church was simply transferred to the asphalt. I got in, adjusted the rearview mirror, and started the engine. The sound was too loud in the quiet air. I put the car in drive and pulled up slowly behind the hearse. I followed the hearse alone to the grave. The drive was short, maybe 10 minutes, leading out of the nice, established neighborhood and into the newer section of the cemetery, a raw landscape of freshly turned earth and shiny, unweathered headstones. The drive itself was a silent procession of two, Henry's body and my witness. I kept a measured distance, watching the precise movement of the polished black vehicle. Its back windows were dark, reflecting the relentless sun. I knew Henry was in there, laid out on a silk sheet, utterly alone. I thought of the steel bird he had given me, the symbol of permanent, industrial love. It felt like a lifetime ago. The world outside the glass moved at its normal, unconcerned pace. Cars sped past on the main road. Teenagers laughed on the sidewalk. Their lives were vibrant, loud, and entirely oblivious to the final, necessary silence of the little black hearse. We arrived at the site. It was marked by a small, green canvas tent erected over a patch of wet earth. The canvas was pulled taut, designed to create a small, temporary illusion of shelter against the impossible reality beneath it. The 6 men who handled the casket were quiet and efficient. They moved with the practiced reverence of those who deal with death daily.
They did not look at me. They saw a ritual, not a person. The pastor, Michael, materialized again, his gentle pity renewed for this second, more intimate phase of the goodbye. There were no chairs beneath the tent, only the deep, precise hole in the ground. I stood at the edge, beneath the stretched canvas, the sole audience for the final performance. The mechanics of the burial were brutal in their efficiency. The silent lowering of the box, the almost imperceptible shudder as the heavy machinery engaged the straps. I watched the mahogany island descend slowly into the dark, wet earth. It was a descent into silence, into finality. The light filtered through the green canvas, casting a sickly hue over the scene. The air smelled of damp soil and the fading sweetness of the flowers which had been moved from the church. Pastor Michael began the final committal words. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. His voice was a thin, high sound against the massive silence of the open grave. I did not hear the words. I saw the empty space next to me. I saw the children, Camille and Darren, not in their expensive, tailored clothes or their chaotic party attire, but as small children standing there, holding my hands, terrified of the deep, dark hole. I had shielded them from that terror then. I had always shielded them from the consequences of that terror. And now they left me here to shield myself. Then came the moment that shattered the composure. The mechanism disengaged. Henry's box rested at the bottom. The machinery pulled back, leaving a vast, empty space between me and the coffin. The funeral director, a man named Mr. Peterson, stepped forward. He carried a small, clean, silver shovel. He scooped up a handful of loose dirt from the pile beside the hole. He handed the shovel to me. It was heavier than I expected. The handle was cold. The dirt, still moist and dark, was heavy. It was the physical weight of separation. I leaned over the edge. I looked down into the deep, dark hole. I could just make out the top of the mahogany box, an impossible distance away. I let the dirt fall. Thud. It was a small sound, a punctuation mark on 50 years of relentless labor. The sound of Henry Hayes, the man of principles and industry, being laid Henry, underground, while the world scrolls on. The realization arrived, cold and sharp. This was the ultimate, final service I could perform for him, and I performed it alone. I handed the shovel back to Mr. Peterson. He nodded, his eyes kind but distant. He took the shovel, and he gave the signal to his team to begin the process of filling the hole. I stood there, watching, the rhythmic sound of the dirt falling, heavier now, louder. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of my life being covered over. The conflict now was purely internal. The narrator contemplates who she became during a life of giving. I had worn the gold band thin, not just with laundry and cooking, but with my own relentless need to be needed. I paid Darren's debts and polished Camille's silver. I accepted Henry's silence when he was wounded by my choice. I had become the constant, the immovable object of unconditional love. But what happens when the constant stops being seen? I saw Henry's shoulders slumped at the potting bench after I wrote the check for Darren. I saw Camille's clinical smile as she spoke of silent martyrdom. I saw the janitor turning on the fluorescent lights in the empty church. They had all benefited from my immobility. They had all taken the foundation for granted. I loved the feeling of being essential. I loved the feeling of fixing the things they broke. I loved the power of silent sacrifice. And in that love of sacrifice, I had taught them that I was an inexhaustible resource, a natural phenomenon like rain or gravity that required no attention or gratitude. I had sacrificed my own visibility. I had purchased their freedom at the cost of my own dignity.
I stepped back from the grave. I did not look at the flowers again. My duty to Henry was done. The ritual was complete. The contract of motherhood had been broken not by the children's choices, but by my own flawed, enabling devotion. I turned and walked away from the green canvas tent. I walked back toward the car, toward the empty sedan, carrying only the profound, silent exhaustion of a woman who had just buried her husband, and in doing so, had finally buried the illusion of her own indispensability. The drive home was longer. The sedan felt enormous, echoing with the absence of Henry's presence. I drove slowly, my attention locked on the geometric precision of the road lines. I returned to a house that was too clean, too silent. The air was heavy, smelling faintly of the lilies and the disinfectant I had used before the wake. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the carpet. I moved through the living room with mechanical precision. I put my coat away. I placed my purse on the counter. The hidden pocket contained the thin, cold gold of my wedding band, the band that was now simply a relic. I went into the kitchen. I did not cook. I put the kettle on. The process was ritualistic, slow. The whistle of the kettle was the first loud, honest sound the house had heard all day. I made a single cup of tea, chamomile. Henry always said it was the color of quiet. I sat at the kitchen table in Henry's customary chair, the one with the slight lean that only he had ever noticed. I drank the tea slowly. It was bitter, scalding, a private penance. The house was not empty. It was full of Henry's silence. Then the digital invasion began. My phone, resting on the polished wood of the kitchen counter, began to vibrate, a faint, restless hum against the quiet wood. It buzzed once, then again, and again. The low-level, insistent demand of the modern world intruding on my profound, fragile silence. I picked it up. The screen glowed with unread messages. The source? Camille and Darren. Texts and vague apologies arrived the evening after. I opened Camille's first. It was long, articulate, and utterly devoid of genuine feeling. Camille, 7:15 p.m. Mom, I am so sorry about today. I feel just awful. Simon's entire firm was at the gala, and it was a strategic failure to leave early. I sent the lilies. I wish I could be there with you tonight, but this is the critical growth period for my career. Please know that Dad understood. He always told me to prioritize my success. Sending all my love. I'll call you next week, promise. It was a perfectly crafted legal brief. It itemized her actions, sent the lilies, listed her defense, strategic failure, critical growth period, and invoked the deceased as a witness for her own moral integrity. The message was not about Henry's loss or my pain. It was about preserving her own self-image. It was an email of emotional damage control, no real remorse. I scrolled to Darren's. It was short, chaotic, and self-pitying. Darren, 22:07 p.m. Hey, Mom. Seriously messed up today. I was supposed to be there. I got stuck in this huge networking lunch that went way late,
And I felt so guilty, I just couldn't bring myself to come. I couldn't face you. Tell Dad I'm sorry. I really am trying to get my life together. Can you call me tomorrow? I need to chat about something important. His apology quickly pivoted to his own emotional state. Felt so guilty, couldn't face you, and ended with a cliffhanger, a request for a future service. The conversation was already shifting from Henry's funeral to Darren's next financial need. The urgency of his personal emergency always eclipsed the slow, silent needs of the family. I set the phone back on the counter. I did not reply. I felt the immense weight of the choice. To answer was to reestablish the old transaction, my comfort in exchange for their peace. The answer was to tell them, "It's okay, I'm still here, I'm still the engine you don't have to look at." I stared at the screen. The faint light of their excuses pulsed beneath the glass. I reached out my hand and touched the phone. I did not tap reply. I simply slid the phone across the polished counter toward the wall until it was out of easy reach. The movement was not dramatic. It was a precise, quiet decision. I was choosing silence. Not the silence of grief, but the silence of self-respect. The moment was clear. I set the phone down and chose silence. I would no longer be the audience for their well-crafted excuses. I would no longer provide the cheap absolution they sought. The price of their conscience was no longer within my budget. I sat back in Henry's chair, the worn leather cushion molding itself around me. I finished the bitter tea. The air in the house was still heavy with absence, but the buzzing had stopped. The digital connection to the people who had abandoned me was broken. I looked out the window. The reflection of the room was dark and profound. I was alone, but the loneliness was no longer an indictment. It was a condition of peace. I had buried Henry. Now, I was choosing to bury the woman who begged for love. The redemption was not in shouting or anger. It was in the clarity of the quiet, deliberate disconnect. I closed my eyes and breathed in the cool, silent air. The battle was over. The boundary was drawn. The sun rose on the day after the funeral with a strange, uncompromising efficiency. It was a clear, pale light that flooded the kitchen, highlighting every speck of dust and every unused surface. The silence was different this morning. It was no longer the heavy, pressurized silence of abandonment, but an expansive, wide-open vacuum. A silence that demanded to be filled with intention.
I woke naturally, without the familiar anxiety of checking the clock for Henry or the phone for the children. I felt a deep, physical exhaustion, the kind that settles into the bone, but beneath it, a tiny, hard kernel of clarity. I went to the kitchen. I did not move automatically to Henry's side of the counter. I moved to the middle. I started a ritual. I took out a single, clean plate, a single coffee mug, a small pot for one serving of oatmeal. I had cooked meals for 3 or 4 for 50 years. Now I cooked breakfast for one, with slow, deliberate precision. Each step was a small, profound act of acceptance. The house had always operated on the principle of we. Now the only viable pronoun was I. The ritual felt like a new kind of prayer. I focused on the sound of the spoon stirring the thick oats, the soft sigh of the coffee brewing, the rhythmic click of the ceramic against the wood. These were clean, honest sounds. They were sounds of self-sufficiency. I sat down at the table, still in Henry's customary chair, facing the garden. The chair no longer felt like a betrayal of his absence. It felt like a silent conversation with his memory. I ate slowly, watching the early light hit the glass. Then, the dam broke. It was not triggered by a memory or a regret. It was triggered by the simple, complete stillness. The oatmeal was perfect. The coffee was hot. The house was quiet. Everything was exactly as it should be, and no one was coming to break it. I placed the spoon down. I did not sob. The grief that had been held captive by the shock and the logistical duties of death finally found its voice. The tears arrived in private. They were hot, silent, and relentless. They were not tears for the husband I lost. That grief had its own slow, measured ache. They were tears for the woman I had just buried, the wife, the mother, the enabler who had spent 50 years begging, silently, to be seen. I cried for the steel bird I had loved more than the attention of my own daughter. I cried for the check I had written for Darren, which had driven a wedge between me and Henry. I cried for the 1,000 invisible shifts I had worked. The tears washed the self-pity clean. When the stream slowed, I simply sat there, feeling the emptiness of my tear ducts and the profound cold relief of the realization I had nothing left to lose. The abandonment was total. The fear was exhausted. I stood up. I washed the single plate, the single mug. I dried them precisely and put them away. I walked to the hall closet where my coat still hung, smelling faintly of old lilies and cemetery dirt. I reached into the purse and found the zippered pocket. I pulled out the gold wedding band. It looked small and insignificant in the bright morning light. I walked to Henry's study, a small, organized room he had retreated to after the layoff. I opened his top desk drawer. Inside was an old cedar-lined box where he kept keepsakes, his father's pocket watch, a folded map of their honeymoon road trip, and the small steel bird I had loved. I placed the worn wedding band inside the box, next to the steel bird. The two symbols of commitment, one forged in industry, one worn thin by devotion, were now safely stored. Not forgotten, but retired. I closed the drawer. The click was quiet, decisive. I returned to the kitchen and stood at the back door, looking out at the small garden. Henry's tomatoes were ripening in the sun. The earth was a rich, dark brown. It was a space of honest work, untouched by the children's excuses. This was the first full morning without clutching for approval. It was a ritual of freedom, a slow, deep breath of air that was entirely mine. The turning point was not an explosion. It was the cessation of movement, the moment I stopped paddling against the current of their indifference. It happened in the quiet air of the afternoon, standing at the kitchen counter, realizing the phone across the room remained silent. I had given it all night to buzz, to demand, to explain. It did neither. The silence of the phone was their final answer. And my response was to simply turn my back on it. The internal turning point was immense in its stillness. It was the moment I realized my identity as a mother was not dependent on their need. My entire life had been defined by a low-level, perpetual emotional maintenance, ensuring their comfort, smoothing their path, and most crucially, trying to earn back a debt of gratitude they believed they had already paid off with a text message. I realize I will no longer chase their attention or approval. The realization felt like a sudden drop in altitude, a dizzying sense of lightness. The chronic, low-grade pain of waiting vanished. I thought of Camille. She was waiting for me to validate her therapeutic justification, to confirm her strategic choice. She was waiting for me to call and say, "I understand your life is important. I forgive you." I would not call. She could keep her moral safety net. I would not weave it for her anymore. I thought of Darren. He was waiting for the phone to ring so he could quickly segue from a vague apology into a financial request, a fresh crisis that would force my attention back onto him. I would not call. He needed to feel the cold, hard weight of the consequence Henry had always wanted him to face. This was not revenge. Revenge requires the energy of hate and the choreography of confrontation. This was simpler, cleaner, and ultimately more devastating to their established reality. This was a withdrawal of oxygen. I was not punishing them, I was simply protecting myself. I took a large, dark blanket from the linen closet. I walked to Henry's old leather chair in the living room, the one where the cushion was molded to his shape. I draped the blanket over it, covering the chair completely. It was a formal retirement. The chair would remain in the room, a piece of furniture, but it was no longer his. I was honoring the dignity of his permanent rest. Then I walked through the house, systematically closing all the interior doors. The doors to the spare bedrooms, where the children slept on their rare, scheduled visits. The door to the formal dining room, where we had hosted silent, tense holiday meals. Each door was closed softly, not slammed in anger, but clicked shut with precise finality. They were no longer open invitations. They were walls. An image. A closed door that didn't slam, it simply became a boundary. I was setting up an emotional barrier, a clear signal that the geography of this house had changed. The center of the universe was no longer the path leading outward to them. The center was now inward. I realized the quiet strength of the person Henry had been, the man of principles, the man who knew how to enforce a clear boundary with silence. I had confused silence with shame. Now I understood. Silence was protection. I sat back in the kitchen watching the still, covered phone. I felt a sense of spaciousness. The anxiety was gone. I was finished with the currency of sacrifice. My self-worth would no longer be a negotiable asset, subject to their convenience. I had nothing left to prove to the people who chose a party over their father's coffin. I would move forward with the clean, cold certainty that I was finished begging. My new life would be built on the quiet, unearned respect I would grant myself. The days began to flow, marked not by waiting for a phone call, but by the slow, deliberate accumulation of small acts. Renewal was not a sudden burst of energy, but a quiet, patient restoration. My library work continued, the order of the books a steady, reliable comfort. I focused on the pages, the spine, the scent of old paper. I found solace in the simple, predictable contract of the system. Every book had its place. Unlike my family, the library did not require emotional maintenance. I returned to Henry's garden. It was the only part of the house the children had never contaminated with expectation or debt. I pulled weeds not with anger, but with purpose. I nurtured the ripening tomatoes, finding a profound satisfaction in their slow, honest growth. Small routines, walks, a new book club return, and volunteering. I started a new routine, weekly visits to the grave. I drove the sedan back to the cemetery every Sunday morning. The new headstone was already placed, a simple gray granite block. I brought simple white carnations, not the expensive cloying lilies of the funeral, but simple white flowers that had a simple, clean smell. I would sit on the small, portable bench I carried in the trunk. I would sit there for an hour, not talking to Henry, but simply existing next to him. The purpose of these visits was not to mourn the loss, but to acknowledge the dignity of the man who was gone. Henry was the only person in my life who had demanded honesty and self-respect. Sitting by his grave, I was practicing the boundary he had always wanted me to enforce. I was honoring his principles. I joined a book club. The sign-up sheet had been on the library bulletin board for 6 months, ignored. Now I saw it. The first meeting felt terrifying. I had to introduce myself not as Henry's wife or Camille and Darren's mother, but simply as Eleanor. The women were kind, talkative, and completely uninterested in my past. They wanted to discuss literature. They wanted to discuss ideas. They were interested in the texture of my thoughts, not the history of my sacrifice. It was a strange, liberating form of exposure. I learned to speak again, not in the defensive, guarded whispers of the past, but in the clear, low tones of an adult with her own opinions. I started volunteering at the local animal shelter. The dogs required simple, profound things: food, water, a walk, and a clean kennel. Their need was honest, unvarnished. They did not disguise their affection as duty or their neglect as professionalism. They taught me the difference between honest need and emotional manipulation. I began to feel softness in habit rather than validation from children. I found small, undeniable joys: the cool weight of a newly shelved book, the earthy smell of the freshly turned soil, the warm, loyal weight of a dog's head resting on my knee. I realized I was no longer waiting for the phone to ring. I was no longer checking the social media feed. The anxiety had been replaced by a quiet, deep focus on the immediate, tangible truth of the present moment. I was rebuilding, not a family, but myself. I was making my life into a structure so sturdy, so self-sufficient, that the emotional erosion of my children could no longer threaten its foundation. The freedom was not loud. It was a quiet, deep, persistent current of inner strength. The boundaries I had erected, the closed doors, the silence on the phone, did not go unnoticed forever. The system I had built for them, the one that required me to be an instant, invisible resource, began to fail. The children, facing crises, finally began to search for the engine they had forgotten was separate from the machine. Camille's call came 2 months after the funeral. It was not a call of affection, but of professional panic. Simon's firm was downsizing, and her job was at risk. "Mom," she said, her voice thin, stripped of its protective layer of competence, "it's a nightmare. I've never been unemployed. I don't know what to do." I listened. I did not interrupt. I did not offer a quick solution. I simply let her speak, hearing the raw, unpolished fear that she hadn't allowed to surface since she left for college. When she finished, I paused. I spoke slowly, my voice calm, modulated, and entirely without urgency. "That sounds stressful, Camille. I remember when your father was laid off. It's a terrible feeling. But what should I do? Should I call this recruiter? Should I fly to New York?" She pressed, waiting for the old, guiding hand. "Camille, you are a successful, intelligent woman. You went to the best school. You need to sit down and build a strategy that works for your life now. You know how to do this." I offered empathy, not enablement. I gave her the respect of her own competence. I did not offer my time, my network, or my money. I offered what was healthy, not everything. The possibility of reconciliation exists, but is no longer unconditional. She was silent. She was waiting for the answer key. I did not provide it. The conversation ended with a strange, hesitant "thank you" that felt more genuine than any "I love you" she had sent in a text. Darren's crisis arrived a week later. It was predictably financial. He was facing eviction from his apartment. He called, frantic, chaotic. "Mom, please, just a loan. I swear I'll pay it back. I'll be homeless. You can't let this happen." His emotional pitch was high, designed to bypass my reason and trigger my old panic. It failed. I sat in Henry's chair, the covered form a reminder of the lesson learned. "Darren," I said, my voice kind but firm, "you are in a serious situation. You need a solution, not a temporary fix. I can't write that check for you.
A sound of raw, childish disbelief came through the phone. You can't? You just won't? I won't. But I can sit down with you and look at the numbers. We can go over the budget. We can find you a small apartment and a second job. I can help you build the structure to survive this. I offered labor, but only the labor of teaching him to stand. I was offering moral complexity, not unconditional bailout. He hung up. The abrupt cutoff was a small, familiar echo of the past. He was angry. He was betrayed, not by my absence, but by the sudden, immovable presence of a boundary. They had reached out when things broke in their lives, and they had found not the old, soft cushion of the mother who begged to be loved, but the new hard certainty of a woman who loved herself first. The tension was immense, but this new tension was a productive one. It was the necessary friction of growth, not the exhausting pressure of decay. The final betrayal was over. The true work of redemption was a continued quiet commitment to the boundary. I had stopped performing the role of the martyr, and the stage had gone dark. The house finally settled into its purpose. It was a shelter for one, filled with books, the simple, honest needs of the garden, and the steady, clean rhythm of a life lived for itself. I kept Henry Steele Bird on my bookshelf. It was no longer a reminder of a promise, but a testament to its permanence. It was a beautiful, inert object. Like Henry, it required nothing from me now but quiet appreciation. I looked at my hands. They were still scarred from the old work, the dryness from the cleaning shifts, the slight tremor from the late nights, but they were now moving with a new, easy grace. They were tending the garden, turning the pages of new books, and resting finally on my own lap in the evening.
I realized the ultimate truth. I had sought the noisy validation of my children when the most profound validation I needed was Henry's quiet approval, which he had always given, even when I failed him. I had been afraid to be alone, and in my fear, I had allowed myself to be ignored. My greatest strength was not my capacity to give, but my capacity to stop. The revenge was not on them. The revenge was on the lie I had lived. I reclaimed my peace not by seeking justice, but by refusing to participate in the injustice of my own life anymore. I drove to the cemetery one last time. It was early, the air cool and silver. The sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, catching the edge of Henry's granite stone. I stood there, feeling the new warmth on my face. I had not brought flowers. I had brought only myself. The grave was no longer a symbol of loss. It was a marker of change. I spoke, a low, clear sound in the still morning air. I am fine, Henry. The house is quiet. The roof is still holding. The answer was the cool, vast silence of the morning, and in that silence I heard my own voice, strong and unhurried. I looked toward the sunrise, a soft orange light spreading across the landscape. The sky was boundless. My life was boundless. The peace I found was not the absence of sadness, but the absence of need. I walked back to the sedan, my steps even and light. I was no longer Eleanor, the wife who buried her husband, or the mother who was betrayed. I was the woman who finally chose herself. The camera lingers on the peaceful rising sun, catching the glint of the granite headstone. Maybe love isn't proven by who stays, but by who stands alone with dignity.
Have you ever had to stop chasing someone who hurt you? Share your story below.